In many of the other lectures that you've listened to today, you've heard a lot about plants that have been really important in Hawaii and Hawaiian culture in the past. Today I want to change gears a little bit and talk about two plants that are really important in Hawaii today, but that haven't been for very long. And those plants are chocolate and coffee. And what I want to do is give you an abbreviated ethnobotanical history of coffee and chocolate, because these are two plants which are great examples of plants that have helped to transform the cultures and the places in which to which they were introduced. And they're also great examples of the ways in which how a culture perceives of a plant can change drastically over time. Now, coffee and chocolate are two of various different kinds of what we could call stimulating beverages. These are psychoactive plants. Now, when we think about psychoactive plants, many of you will probably think about coca or opium poppies. But psychoactive plants are actually any plants that can alter a mental state or an individual's perception by producing feelings of tranquility or invigoration or euphoria or otherworldliness, etc. So in addition to all the drugs that probably come to mind when you think about psychoactive plants are things like coffee and chocolate and tea and tobacco, kola nut, yerba mate, etc. Now these stimulating beverages, coffee, tea, cacao, kola nut, which is was used in Coca-Cola, and yerba mate, which has become increasingly popular here and some of you may have tried, all are stimulating beverages. They're psychoactive plants because they all contain the alkaloid caffeine and or its relatives, such as theobroma, for example, in chocolate. Caffeine causes certain physiological effects in humans. Caffeine is a central nervous system stimulant and is also a mild diuretic. The caffeine in a cup of coffee reaches your bloodstream in 5 minutes. It then circulates throughout your body, it can stimulate your heart, increase stomach acidity, increase urine output, and cause a 10% rise in metabolic rate. Caffeine makes you feel alert because it mimics feelings that are produced when the body releases the hormone adrenaline. Caffeine is the widely active psychoactive drug. And this is not only because a lot of people drink coffee and tea, but also because, as many of you know, caffeine is also added to soft drinks, sodas, etc. Of course, caffeine in high doses can also have negative effects. It can cause dizziness or headaches, produce anxiety, heart palpitations, etc. So worldwide, coffee is probably the most important in terms of production, stimulating beverage consumed in the world. 90% of coffee comes from one species, Coffea arabica. The other 10% come from a couple other species of the same genus. Many of you will be familiar with coffee berries. The coffee plant produces these red berries. Inside the red juicy berries are 2 seeds, and these are what we call the coffee beans. These beans are dried out in the sun and then undergo a type of fermentation process, an enzymatic fermentation process, and then they're roasted and ground, and this is how we get the coffee that many of you are familiar with. Coffee, believe it or not, doesn't come from Colombia as many people think. But coffee is native to the highlands of Ethiopia, and there's a legend associated with how coffee was discovered. If you remember back when I was talking about, in another lecture when I was talking about wild food plants, I said that many times people learn whether a plant is edible or not by watching other animals. Well, this legend fits in with that. The legend or the story goes that a goat herder was out with his goats and he noticed that they were eating these coffee berries, and when they ate them became all frisky and jumped around. And so he tried the berries himself and the seeds in them, of course, and found the same thing. In Ethiopia, the the berries are actually, the berries and the seeds, the fruits were consumed raw, and the leaves were also chewed. And apparently when the Ethiopian people went on hunting raids, what they would do would be prepare this food that was made of either green berries or roasted and ground coffee beans covered with fat, and this is what they would take with them. The drinking of coffee actually apparently came much later, though it is believed that brewing was first done in Ethiopia. In fact, some researchers think that people first made an alcoholic beverage from coffee and that the non-alcoholic beverage came after that. Coffee arrived in Yemen sometime before the 14th century, though the date estimates vary. Some people think it arrived substantially before that. There it was used as a medicine, and it was also brewed. It was introduced into Constantinople by the Turks, and in 1616 it was introduced into Italy. Before this, the Europeans knew of coffee, but they knew it largely or only as a medicine, or if anything at all. Coffee began to become popular in Europe. Apparently, the priests of Vienna urged the Pope to ban the drink, as it come from the so-called land of the infidels. Right, it was introduced from Arabia, but apparently, after trying coffee, the Pope Clement VIII baptized it and made it a Christian drink. By the 1650s, coffee really then took off in Europe. Now, again, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about coffee in this lecture was because it's a great example of a plant that really had a big influence on culture. And in this particular case, coffee changed, for various reasons, European culture. And the perception of coffee in Europe changed over time as well. In the beginning, coffee was welcomed as a panacea medicine. It was thought that it could cure almost anything. Here's a quote that was written of the properties of coffee at the time, the medicinal properties, and you can see here that people thought it could do anything. It says, coffee is good for colic. It fortifies the gallbladder, brings relief in case of dropsy, purifies the blood, soothes the stomach, whets the appetite, but can also decrease it, keeps you awake, but can also induce sleep. It cools hot temperaments, but can also warm up cold ones. It has the power to sober up a drunk person. So again, here, this is an example of how coffee was seen as this medicine that can pretty much do anything. The other thing is that coffee began to be seen by the middle classes as the great soberer, and it came for some people as a great welcome to the replacement of alcohol. Now, to appreciate this, you've got to keep in mind that prior to the introduction of the potato, beer was second only to bread as the main source of nutrition for Central and Northern Europeans. Okay, so beer was a major part of the diet. For example, an English family in the latter half of the 17th century consumed about 3 liters, that's almost 1 gallon, of beer per person daily. That's children included, okay? And just to give you an example, as a rule, breakfast consisted of beer soup. Just so you know what that is, here's the recipe. Heat the beer in a saucepan. In a separate small pot, beat a couple of eggs. Add a chunk of butter to the hot beer. Stir in some cold beer to cool it, and then pour over the eggs. Add a bit of salt, and finally mix all the ingredients together, whisking it well to keep it from curdling. Finally, cut up a roll, white bread or other good bread, and pour the soup over it. You may also sweeten to taste with sugar. Actually, this is another example of how cultural perceptions of plants, of drinks made from plants, in this case beer, have greatly changed over time. I don't think anybody here would think about, well, maybe having beer soup for breakfast as a staple. In any case, beer was a really important part of European culture, not only as nutrition, but as entertainment as well. People did a lot of drinking. There's a lot of drunkenness. There were beer competitions apparently a lot of the time when participants were only finished when they were knocked out unconscious, etc. Now, for these reasons, coffee was, when it was introduced into Europe, was seen as a great soberer and adopted by the Reformists. Now, from the 14th to the 16th century, the Reformation had occurred in Europe. This is when people protested against the corruption of the Catholic Church at the time. and split up all as their own group known as the Protestants. Now, one of the views held by the Protestants was that hard work and self-discipline were really important. This is what we know as the Protestant work ethic. Many viewed alcohol and people's consumption of alcohol as an impediment to hard work and therefore honest living, and therefore they really welcomed coffee. It's interesting because the old traditions the old traditions of alcohol drinking, because people were so dependent on it as a nutrition source as well, really couldn't die until a substitute could come in and replace them, and that substitute was coffee. Here's a poem that sums up these sentiments of the badness of, thought of by these people at the time, of the badness of alcohol and the good that coffee was bringing in. So the poem, which you can read, refers to the treacherous grape, drowning reason, besieging brains, etc. And then heaven sending in this all-healing berry, which is coffee, which arrives and heals the stomach, makes the genius quicker, relieves the memory, revives the sad, cheers the spirit, etc., etc. In fact, coffee became to be seen as the opposite of everything that was bad or slow or dumb. Interesting, coffee at the time was also viewed as something that decreased sexual impulses. And apparently at one point this fostered a protest from women who put up a petition that read, "The Women's Petition Against Coffee, representing to the public consideration the grand inconveniences accruing to their sex from the excessive use of the drying, enfeebling liquor." Again, these are perceptions of plants that have really changed over time. Now, coffee also changed European culture in another way, in that coffee houses were created. And these coffee houses, where people went to sit and drink coffee, alcoholic beverages weren't served, became centers of communication and centers of intellectual exchange, of news and business, etc. And the importance of this, you've got to remember, is because at this time there weren't public spaces for this kind of communication. There weren't daily newspapers in the way that we know them today. The drinking of coffee led to the creation of these coffee houses, which led to the creation of these spaces for communication, and not just for commerce, but also for journalism and for literature. So people went to coffee houses not just to discuss business, which they did as well, but also to discuss political ideas and literary ideas, etc. So the coffee influenced middle-class culture in Europe in many ways, mostly as a social center and a site of public life where these new forms of culture and commerce were formed. In London in 1700, there were something like 3,000 coffee houses. That's one for every 200 people, which is pretty amazing. The number of taverns at the time was apparently only 1,000. So this gives you an idea of the importance of coffee houses at the time and the way in which they could have influenced and shaped culture. At first, coffee was only drunk in public places, i.e. in these coffee houses. And it took between 50 to 100 years or so, depending on the parts of Europe, for people to begin to drink it in their houses, and for it to become something that was consumed in the home, in the family as well. Coffee, of course, was eventually brought over to the United States, and in fact, during the Boston Tea Party, it became a patriotic drink in the United States. Coffee was brought to Hawaii, and the first planting was in Oahu in 1813. Apparently that planting failed, but another planting was made in Manoa, right here in 1825, and then that soon spread, and then coffee soon spread to the other islands. Apparently it was people tried growing it in large plantations, in Kauai in particular, but due to labor supply and fluctuating prices and the blight, it failed, and those places were converted to sugarcane. So from about 1920 on, all commercially grown coffee was then coming only from Kona on the Big Island. For years after the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy, Hawaii's government offered coffee lands, or tried to convince Caucasian immigrants to come take the coffee lands. Later, those people subdivided their lands to tenants who were largely Japanese, and in Kona, many Japanese continue to farm coffee today. And coffee, of course, Kona coffee is associated with one of the images of Hawaii. When tourists come here, they buy Kona coffee and take it back. It's become a symbol to a certain degree. The coffee itself is processed by harvesting the fruit and removing the fruit from the coffee beans or the seeds, either through a wet or through a dry process, and then roasting them. For the dry process, the fresh berries are just laid out and dried in the sun, and then the pericarp that's covering them is rasped off. In the wet process, it was a little more complicated and apparently produces the highest quality flavor and aroma. The fresh fruits are depulped by machine, and then the seeds or the beans are washed, and then they're allowed to ferment, undergo this fermentation process, which is an enzymatic fermentation process, for about 12 to 24 hours. And it's this process that produces the substances that will eventually give coffee its aroma and its taste. After fermentation, then they're going to put out in the sun for at least a week, and then they're roasted. Now, as I mentioned in the lecture on major world crops, it's not just the consumption of plant foods that stimulates and fosters change in cultures, but it's their very production. And certainly the production of coffee across the world as a result of the great demand and the rising prices, at least at certain points in history, has had profound cultural implications. One of the implications is that the creation of large coffee plantations in various parts of the world has resulted in the displacement of indigenous peoples from the places or the lands on which they lived. Of course, the displacement of a culture from the land on which it is a part has profound cultural implications in terms of changes and loss in cultural traditions. Of course, other cultural traditions are gained due to the places where people are moved to. But the effects are very big. Many of these displaced people then went on to work on coffee plantations for part of the year in conditions often very similar to slave labor, and the conditions in many places continue to be very bad for the workers. And this led to the creation of what's called fair trade coffee, which some of you may have heard of. Fair trade coffee ensures that the coffee pickers are treated fairly and earn fair wages. And fair trade coffee you can buy in places like Down to Earth or Kokua and some other places here. The growing of coffee as a major world crop now, of course, also has environmental implications, as coffee can be grown in the open sun and it can also be grown in the shade, known as shade-grown coffee, so under the overstory of the forest. When forest is cut down to plant coffee, not only are people displaced and cultural traditions changed or lost through that displacement, but of course everything that lived in the forest before is also gone. It's eventually led to concerns in North America for an interesting reason. That is, songbirds who spend the summers in North America, in Canada and the United States, and fly down to Latin America during the winter months, started not returning back from their voyages, and people began to notice this. One of the reasons, of course, was the large destruction of the forest to which these birds flew for things like coffee and other crops that were being planted and that are being planted. So this led to the promotion of shade-grown coffee, which is coffee grown in the understory of the forest. This means that the tall trees in the forest don't need to be cut down, and the forest habitat is maintained so birds can come down and there's places for them, of course, to live and to eat, etc., as well as, of course, all the other animals that live there throughout the year. So again, coffee, a really important example of a plant that has changed cultures in the places to which it's been introduced, and also, of course, in the places in which it is produced. Chocolate, or Theobroma cacao, is another great example of this, but has had different kinds of cultural implications. Chocolate comes in the fruits or pods of Theobroma cacao, or the chocolate tree. The pods or the fruits grow right off the stems or the trunks of the tree, and inside the pods are a whole bunch of seeds that are covered in this white pulp, which is actually really delicious. It's very sweet. Under the pulp are the cacao seeds, and these are the seeds that make chocolate. These seeds or beans are fermented and then dried and then roasted and consumed as chocolate. It's a fermentation, again, like in the coffee, that produces the characteristic aroma and flavor of chocolate. Again, this fermentation process is not the same kind of fermentation that goes on in the production of alcohol. It's an enzymatic fermentation. Each pod contains about 50 seeds, which is about 100 grams of chocolate, to give you an idea. Now, chocolate is native to Latin America. The wild chocolate has a distribution from Amazon all the way up to about southern Mexico. But it was originally domesticated about 2,000 years ago or so by the Mayans in South Mexico. And by the 7th century, people were growing it widely across Mexico. Chocolate was very important, or cacao was very important, in Aztec and Mayan cultures. The Mayans and the Aztecs thought that cacao had a divine origin, and therefore the name Theobroma, or food of the gods. The Aztec name for chocolate was cacahuatl, which is where our word chocolate comes from. In these pictures, you can see here a god offering chocolate to a mortal. Cacao was very important in Mayan and Aztec cultures. It was consumed in drinks, along with chilies and vanilla and corn. And it was also used in rituals and ceremonies. It was paid as a tribute to the Aztec Empire. And it was also used as a currency in Central America, in fact, up until the 18th century. Moctezuma, the last ruler of the Aztecs, was reported to have drunk 50 golden goblets of cacao every day. And this cacao was made with achiote, or annatto, also known as annatto, or the lipstick plant, mixed with chili and vanilla. So cacao played an important role in the cultures in which it originated. With the arrival of the Spaniards in Latin America, the Spaniards then spread it to other parts of the world, to Africa, to the Philippines, etc. In fact, it arrived in the Philippines in 1663. And in some parts of the Philippines today, the preparation of cacao is made using methods that are identical to those that were used actually by the Spanish at the time it was introduced then, so in the 1600s. The beans are roasted, and then the shells are removed. Then they're rolled and they're crushed with a bottle and then shaken to remove those shells. Then the rest is made into a paste and let cool, and this is chocolate. So interesting that these methods of preparing chocolate that were introduced to the Philippines at the time have been preserved in some parts. Now, the cultural significance of chocolate in Europe was very different from the cultural significance of coffee in the same places. Chocolate became very popular very quickly with the Catholic Church, and this is because of its nutritive value. Liquids don't break fasts, and so chocolate could serve as a really good nutritional substitute during fasting periods, and of course this made it very important and very popular in places like Italy and Spain. Now, just as coffee was associated with the middle classes and with working in high productivity and efficiency and sobriety, chocolate actually became associated with the aristocracy, with the European royalty, and in fact it became a status symbol in Europe. While coffee stimulated intellectual exchange, chocolate was something that was seen as very luxurious. It was drunk in bed. While coffee was reported to decrease sexual activity, chocolate was perceived as an aphrodisiac. So again, the cultural significance of chocolate in Europe was this very luxurious thing that was a real symbol of status and only consumed by the highest classes. Of course, this perception of chocolate has changed drastically over time. The status dropped when cocoa was created in about 1820. This is most of the oil of the chocolate bean or the seed is removed, and it's made into a powder, which we call cocoa. And cocoa then became associated with breakfast drinks, with children, with gifts, etc. And of course, chocolate and cocoa are now consumed by everybody. So again, an example of how cultural significance of a plant changes over time. One of the interesting things about chocolate is, of course, now it's spread across the world. And this map shows both the consumers of chocolate, which are the browns, and the producers of chocolate. You can see that the consumers of chocolate are not any of the places that produce it. These are all mostly northern countries, with the exception of Australia. And the producers of chocolate are tropical countries. Now, of course, as chocolate moved across cultures and across space, there became a lot of variation in culinary traditions. So hot chocolate is something that's prepared, of course, from chocolate in many places across the world. Mole is another thing that's prepared from chocolate. If any of you have had Mexican food, you might be familiar with mole. It's a sauce in which chicken and other things are cooked, but it's made from chocolate and chilies and pumpkin seeds and other spices as well. Champorado is a chocolate drink made with corn, and there's different variations of it in Mexico. There's different variations also called champorado in the Philippines after chocolate was introduced there. There's milk chocolate, chocolate bars, etc. So again, a great diversity of product and culinary traditions based on this one plant. I talked about the cultural significance of chocolate in Europe and how it changed over time. Well, chocolate certainly holds much cultural significance in the United States today as well. Of course, it's significant as a food, as a snack, as a candy, and as a drink. But it's also significant as a ritual. The giving of chocolates on Valentine's Day, for example, or the bringing of chocolates to dinner as a gift. It has significance in religion as well. For instance, chocolate eggs are associated with Easter. And of course, it holds significance as a social activity, particularly in cold places where drinking hot chocolate on cold days is a social activity. It's something you do after skiing or after skating or after being out in the cold. Go somewhere warm with your friends and drink hot chocolate. Now let me diverge for a moment to talk a little bit about vanilla, just because, as I mentioned, chocolate was originally consumed in Mexico. Chocolate was originally consumed with vanilla. And vanilla is a really neat plant. Vanilla is also, of course, native to Mexico, but it's an orchid. Vanilla, like most plants that are important in a culture, has an origin story, an origin myth. It says that when the world was fresh and still frequented by deities, this is an origin myth by the Totonac people, a beautiful young goddess, Xanath, visited the earth and fell in love with a Totonac warrior. As a goddess, in particular the daughter of the goddess of fertility, Xanath could not marry a mortal, but neither could she abandon him. She ultimately resolved her predicament by bestowing herself upon her lover and his people in the form of a vanilla vine. The blossoming and fruiting of this heavenly plant would provide the Totonacs with the eternal source of happiness. So vanilla, the scientific name is Vanilla planifolia, is an orchid that's native to Mexico, and it's also a vine. It was domesticated by the Totonac culture, who live on the coast of Veracruz, and they began cultivating it at least by the year 1000, so quite a long time ago. When the Totonacs were dominated by the Aztecs, they were forced to pay the vanilla in tribute to the Aztecs, and the Aztec royalties then made drinks of chocolate, vanilla, and corn together. The Totonacs themselves, however, used apparently to flavor food, as a drink, as an aphrodisiac, as an insect repellent, etc. Vanilla is produced from the beans or the fruit of the vanilla orchid, and the process of producing vanilla is quite long and complicated. The orchid flowers and the orchid fruits don't actually smell anything like we know as vanilla. That aroma comes up after a long process of enzymatic fermentation that takes several months, and basically it involves alternating putting the beans out in the sun to dry and then wrapping them in blankets and putting them in these airtight boxes to sweat or to ferment. And again, this process goes over several months until the beans are ready and have developed their characteristic vanilla odor. One interesting thing about vanilla vines and vanilla plants is that the flowers only open for one day, so they need hand pollination to make productivity high. And in fact, the Totonacs did this a whole long time ago to increase yield. They figured it out. Vanilla was, of course, then taken across the world and introduced to many different places. Vanilla was actually grown in Hawaii before World War II. In fact, it was originally used, or it was used before to flavor okolehau. Chocolate has also been introduced to Hawaii, and it was introduced particularly to replace the sugarcane fields when they were closing down as part of a diversification strategy. So now both chocolate and vanilla are produced in Hawaii, and you can get Hawaiian chocolate and vanilla products such as Hawaiian vanilla ice cream. And we'll see how the cultural significance of these plants change over time as people are trying to promote the growing of these two plants in Hawaii. So again, the key concepts here to take home are that coffee and chocolate, like other psychoactive plants, have long histories of cultural, including medicinal and spiritual and religious, uses in places in which they originated. Both plants helped to transform the cultures in the places to which they were introduced. This was due to their psychoactive properties and, of course, to the cultural and social significance to which they were assigned. These plants also provide great examples of how the ways in which cultures perceive of plants changes over time. Now, on the topic of stimulating beverages, I want to just talk really briefly about tea and kola nut and yerba mate, because these are also important stimulating plants. Very briefly, tea, which is a camellia and related to the ornamental camellias many of you may be familiar with, is originally from China. There are a couple of myths as to its origin which are quite interesting. One is that it was discovered in 2737 BC by a Chinese emperor when tea leaves accidentally blew into a pot of boiling water. It was first cultivated apparently more than 2,000 years ago. First it was used as a medicine, and subsequently it was used in Buddhist ceremonies. Another origin story says that tea was a gift from the Buddha, who made it spring from the eyelids of a monk, a Buddhist monk, who had tore out his eyelids because he had vowed to stay awake until the Buddha's work on earth was completed, but unfortunately he slept. And he was so upset with himself that he had slept that he ripped out his eyelids. And when they fell to the ground, apparently the Buddha was pleased with his effort and made tea spring from them when they hit the ground. So tea was thought to be a gift from the Buddha to aid people in their vigils by keeping them awake and enhancing the peaceful and harmonic state of mind. By the 5th or 6th century, tea had begun to be drunk for pleasure. So again, the cultural significance of a plant changing over time. Apparently, after seeing the value of tea in China to enhance religious meditation, a Buddhist priest then introduced it to Japan. As a result, tea in Japan has always been associated with Zen Buddhism. Tea was almost immediately embraced by the emperor. For green tea, the leaves are picked from the tea plant and steamed for only about 45 to 60 seconds, and then they're dried and rolled a few times out. Black tea is made from, of course, the same plant, but the different process. The leaves are spread out and withered, and then they're rolled and crushed to release enzymes that promote fermentation, and then once fermented, they're dried, and this is what produces, again, black tea. Kola nut is native to West Africa, where seeds of various species had long been chewed or used to produce these caffeine-rich beverages, so had been used for a long time in West Africa. Originally, Coca-Cola had cola nuts and coca leaves in it. Now, of course, it's made from artificial cola flavoring, caffeine, and coca leaves from which the cocaine has been removed. Finally, yerba mate is a drink that's becoming increasingly popular in the West. It's native to South America, and it's the leaves that are used that have caffeine in them and are used to produce this stimulating beverage. So again, coffee, tea, cacao, cola, yerba mate, and others are stimulating beverages, psychoactive plants that are really important in our culture in the past and today.